Welcome back to our video series on commissioning a new Schneider XW Pro solar system. In this video, we're going to focus on doing firmware updates to inverters, Insight Edge devices, and anything else in the system that may need an update. So to get started, we're first going to open our web browser and connect to our Insight Edge device. In this particular case, it is an Insight Home by putting in its local IP address. And we log in using our password. Now we can click on Devices on our green ribbon, and it gives you a list of all the devices in this system. As you can see, we have two XW Pro inverters, a master and a slave. We have two MPPT60 charge controllers, an auto gen start, and two system control panels. First, we need to find out the firmware version currently installed on each device. Starting with the Insight Edge device, or in this case, again, an Insight Home, at the top left corner where it says Insight Local, it gives a version number. Currently, we have version 1.09 installed on our Insight Home. Now, at the time of this recording, there is a newer version available, and we'll download that from the Schneider website momentarily. We also need to check the firmware version on our inverters. So we'll click the XW Pro Master Inverter. And in the status screen over here on the right-hand side, we have build number at the bottom. We can see 1.03.00 build number 3 is the current firmware installed. There is definitely a newer version for the XW Pro firmware, and again, we'll download that from the website here in a moment. We'll go back to the list of devices, take a look at the XW Pro slave inverter. We can see it is also running 1.03, so it will need an update as well. And the same applies for all the other devices. Now I know the charge controllers, the AGS, and the system control panels, they are all current on their firmware. So we're just going to focus on the Insight Home and the inverters. So we'll open up a new tab in our web browser and go to sesolar.com, where we can download firmware updates as well as any documentation for any of the Schneider solar products. Once the Schneider website comes up, we'll select Products. We'll go to Insight Energy Management and Insight Home, Insight Edge devices. This is where we'll download the firmware update for our Insight Home device. This takes us to the Insight Home and Insight Facility Edge Devices product page. Here we'll scroll down roughly about 2/3 of the way to the Downloads section. Under Downloads, we open Firmware, and you can see we have firmware version 1.12 available. We'll click Download, and we'll want to save this file, and it's being saved to our Downloads folder. Next, we need to get the firmware update for our XW Pro inverter. So go back to Products, Residential Energy Storage. This is a hybrid inverter, and we want to select the XW Pro 120/240 volt. This is a North American version that we have installed in this site. And here we are at the XW Pro product page. Again, we will scroll down about 2/3 of the way to the Downloads section, open up Firmware, and we have two different firmware versions available. XW Pro 6848, we have a 120 volt version and a 120/240 volt version. If you have a typical split phase installation, the 120/240 volt version is the version you want. The 120 volt version is for 120 volt only inverters. The XW Pro can be converted to a 120 volt only configuration by installing this firmware and doing a hardware modification to the inverter. This is typically only applicable in 3-phase systems. So in our situation, we're going to download the 120/240 volt version, and this is firmware version 1.11. So we'll click Download, and that'll download. At this point, if you wanted to download firmware for any other products, the process is the same. Go to Products, Residential Energy Storage. You can select from the XW Pro SW inverters. charge controllers, including the MPPT60 we have in this system, or the MPPT80 and MPPT100, and various accessories, including the automatic generator start, connects battery monitor, system control panel, etc. Now that we're done downloading the firmware we need, we can close this web browser window. And now we'll go to our downloads folder. And as you can see, these are compressed zip files which need to be uncompressed. So firmware version 1.12, this is the firmware update for our Insight Home. So we're going to right click on that, extract all, because we need to uncompress or extract these zip files in order to get to the firmware updates that we need. And to make things easy, I'm going to place this on the desktop. I'll make a folder called Schneider Firmware Updates. And then inside this folder, I'll make a new folder for Insight Home. And this is where I'm going to extract the firmware update for our Insight Home. Click Extract. And we've extracted that firmware update. And we know where it is. Now we'll do the same with the firmware update for the XW Pro. Back to our Downloads folder, right-click, Extract All. And we are going to browse to our firmware updates. I'll make a new folder here for XW Pro. And extract. Now we have those files extracted and we're ready to install them. As you can see inside the uncompressed version, there's a release notes if you want to read that. This XF0 file, that's the actual firmware file to be installed on the XW Pro inverter. Now we can close these windows and get back to our Insight Local web interface for our Insight Home. It's highly recommended to first install the update on your Insight Edge device, Insight Home in this case. To do that, we select Setup. And in this particular version, version 1.9 of Insight Local, it'll be Install Package. Other versions of Insight Edge device firmware may have slightly different labeling. We'll open Insight Package, Upload Package. Now we'll navigate to where our firmware update is. Desktop, Schneider Firmware Updates, Insight Home, Firmware 1.12. Now we don't want the release notes, this EPKG file. This is the firmware update for the Insight Home. This firmware works on Insight Home, Insight Facility, or the Connects Gateway. They all three devices use the same firmware. So we'll select that, open, and the firmware update is underway. First, it'll upload the file to the Insight Home device, and then it'll begin the installation process. This installation process can take 5 to 10 minutes to complete. Okay, the firmware update is now complete and the Insight Home needs to be restarted. So we'll click Restart Now. Confirm we want to restart. And Insight Home is rebooting right now. And once the reboot is complete, it brings us back to the login screen where we'll log back into our Insight Home device. And as you can see, now that we're logged back in, we're now running version 1.12 on Insight Home. Next, we'll go through the process of updating the firmware on the XW Pro inverters. We've already downloaded the firmware and extracted the firmware file, so we're ready to begin the update process. We'll select the first XW Pro inverter. then select Firmware from the list of options at the top. Now we have the option to upgrade just this inverter, or if you have multiple inverters like this system does, we can upgrade all of them at once. Upgrading all XWs is not going to necessarily be faster, but it's less work you have to do. So we'll select Upgrade All because we have two inverters here. And it is worth noting that during this update, the power output of the inverters will drop out. So make sure you have alternative AC power available to power your computer and any network infrastructure that's allowing your connection to the Insight Home device. If the connection to the Insight Home is dropped during the firmware update process, you can have a corrupt firmware update, which can be recovered from, but it is an extra step and extra time to do so. So we'll click OK. Now we'll navigate to our firmware update on the desktop. Schneider firmware updates is where we placed it. XW Pro firmware. And we want the XF0 file. That's the actual firmware for the inverter. Select that and open. And now the firmware update is underway. It typically takes about 10 minutes per inverter for an XW Pro firmware update. So because we're updating two inverters back to back, this process will take approximately 20 minutes to complete. And now roughly 20 minutes have passed and we can see the firmware has updated successfully on both inverters. So we go back to devices and we can take a look at each inverter and make sure build number version 1.11. So the master is updated. And let's go to the slave. It is also updated as well. Now, one very important step after you update firmware on the XW Pro inverters, there is a new setting called region settings that needs to be set on the entire system. To access that, we click on Setup, and then you see Region Settings. We open this submenu, and it prompts you for a password. The password is XW Pro Grid Codes. Once you've entered the password, click OK, and you'll need to select a region from this pull-down list. The regions you select will depend on your location. If you're in California, for example, selling to the grid, you may need to use California Rule number 21. If you're in Hawaii, HECO Rule 14. And as the firmware progresses, this list will become longer and longer for new grid code requirements for various utilities around the world. If you are off grid or your utility does not have any specific requirements, I recommend using the IEEE 1547 from 2003. Make sure you pick this one and not the 50 hertz version if you're in North America. Select that option, hit apply. It will apply that region setting to both inverters as well as your Insight Edge device. What this is doing is setting several dozen different parameters regarding the AC inputs of the XW Pro inverters. It is critical that this is set because if one of these parameters is not set correctly, it can cause unpredictable behavior from your XW Pro inverters. Okay, we see that the state is good, so the region settings applied properly. And that covers everything for updating firmware on your XW Pro inverters, as well as your Insight Edge device, in this case, an Insight Home. It also applies equally for Insight Facility, as well as Connect's Gateway. If you want to update firmware on any other devices, including charge controllers or other accessories, the firmware update process is identical. You'd select the appropriate device, select firmware, and then navigate to the firmware file that you've downloaded from Schneider's website. And that concludes this video on doing firmware updates on an XW Pro base solar system. Thanks for watching.